Today I'm joined by Soren. They are an accessibility and accessibility ops consultant, as well as Jerry, who is a design systems and accessibility consultant. I am Michelle, a design advocate at Zero Height, and yeah, let's stop the slideshow and begin. So, thank you so much for joining me. And I would love it if we could kick it off with some introductions. So, um, Jerry and Soren, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your accessibility experience and background, kind of what you do, and maybe a fun fact. Jerry, would you like to start?
It's always worth having a fun fact up your sleeve. I'm Jerry. I'm a design systems and accessibility consultant from London. I have spent the last 8 years as a design lead on various design systems, and accessibility was never really officially part of my role, but I've always just seen the need and made it part of my role. You only need to know a little bit more about accessibility than anyone else to become the accessibility expert, and then people start coming to you for advice. So many years down the line, I've recently been hired into my first dedicated accessibility role. I'm now lead accessibility specialist at justeattakeaway.com. Fun fact, I've just learned to do a 180 jump on my roller skates, so expect some broken legs sometime soon.
Wow, I was just gonna say, I was like, you look very put together still. um, Soren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. So I'm Soren Hamby. I am in the New York area. So I actually live in the lower Hudson Valley, but quick shot away from New York City. Uh, and I got into design systems first, but then I started having some accessibility issues of my own when I started experiencing vision loss. And so I have a visual disability as well as many other like invisible disabilities. And yeah, I got really interested in making the internet usable for everyone. So, a lot of people say, like, I want to break the internet. I was like, I want to fix it. Let's make it less broken. So, my fun fact is that I do a lot of like interactive art and glow art, as you can see behind me. This is actually my basement studio. So, I really like a lot of like fun 80s kind of aesthetic stuff, and I do art that touches on the disability experience and also like neurodivergence and gender. So yeah, that's me.
Super cool. Yeah, I'm in awe of the background. I thought it was just like a giant TV that had a design on it, but it's super cool that it's something that you're working on. We'll have to keep inviting you back and seeing the progress you're making.
Yeah, I would love that.
Um, and yeah, to give a little bit of background, I am a product designer who like also did QA testing like way back in the day when we had to. So I for a lot of government agencies, so everything had to be Section 508 compliant. And to Jerry's point of like you only need to know a little bit more about accessibility than other people is super true. Like I think my first foray into accessibility, my first lesson was 30 minutes long and then I became the accessibility expert. So just to let you know, like it doesn't have to be this whole monumental thing. It's really easy to learn about accessibility and start practicing it. And that's what this webinar is about today. So let's jump into some questions. So in the first half I'll ask questions um, with and have a discussion with Soren and Jerry. And the second half, we will answer the audience questions. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to add it into the chat, and we'll get to those. So I think before we jump into some of those like little tips and tricks, I think if we were trying to establish accessibility or a culture of accessibility within our company or into our products, how do we even begin? Like where it just seems very vast and overwhelming. So, do either of you have any thoughts to share?
I'm
Yeah,
happy to kick off. Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. I guess there's two ways in for me, like from the top down and the bottom up. Without some top down standards, you're relying on the grassroots level of the doers, like the people on the front line. And without the support from senior stakeholders to get accessibility on roadmaps, you are doomed. I have been in this position. So, though it sounds very boring, I'd probably start with a top down and get some documented standards in place. Um, okay, I know this sounds boring, just bear with me. If there's no overriding standards, it's really difficult to ask product teams to build accessible products or to enforce accessibility. You know, before you start on anything, you have to agree on an internal standard. This might be, I don't know, a WCAG 2.1 AA, or if you're operating in Europe, one of the unpronounceable EN acts. Um, what I've done in some organizations where there was sort of no policy or guidelines is just to write something myself, socialize it widely, and then try to get a senior stakeholder to champion it. I guess my biggest learning's been, you know, you don't need to be an expert and you don't need permission. There's loads of great free resources online, and you know, you can find a lot of good best practice examples out there. There's no playbook for this. We're all kind of making it up as we go along. um, Obviously there's a lot more to accessibility than policy and standards, but if you're starting out, you need a solid foundation to build on before you get to the fun stuff. Are you going to tell us some fun stuff, Soren?
Oh, I don't
I've
know if
come in
it's
all guidelines and like the police.
I feel like it's so all of it's kind of fun to me because I consider myself to be someone who's a lifelong learner. So I enjoy learning stuff and setting up learning activities for other people. So one of the first things I always do is start documenting things by topic and start trying to break down things into roles. So getting people on board and starting to make it a business as usual. So if I have any kind of influence over how other people do their jobs, like if people are asking for it, especially like people that are curious and are going out of their way, even if we don't have that organizational buy-in, to say like, hey, how can I make my social media posts more accessible? Then I'll give them some standards and guidelines, because just sending people to the WCAG standards and saying like, here, social media person, go read all this stuff about code, is sometimes really daunting, and it's sometimes a little incomprehensible as well. So I think having a little bit of time is the thing that really buy-in will help from that top-down perspective, because you can hit kind of a ceiling of what you can do in your day-to-day of just like applying accessibility to the design or to the code that you're writing, because you need to start applying it outside of just the product, and you need to get buy-in for starting to create service design as well. So you start to kind of change things in the way that you do practice, but you also have to change things in the way that you hire, and that the way that you like do tools, and the way that you build products as well. And it's not just about making sure that UI works with the assistive tech, but it's also about like, what kind of things do disabled people need to be able to use this product effectively, and what other things they need to do to be able to like live their lives. So starting to be able to think about things differently as well is really important, and that's really helpful in building an accessibility culture, even if you just start on a design team or on a development team or a cross-functional team, and say like, how can we as a team start thinking about products differently? Like that's a huge step in it of itself. And just like my background, I mean, even progress is such a beautiful thing. Even if you're not 100%, which I think it's really impossible to do with accessibility because things change so quickly. It's about the journey, and it's about like trying to make progress.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other thing is like, no one can fault you for starting, right? It doesn't have to be 100% there. Maybe it's not even 100% accurate, but if you're trying your best and trying to take that first step in the journey to help your team and products have more accessibility or build that accessibility culture, no one's going to be like, "Why did you do that?" Everyone's going to be really excited that you took that first step, because sometimes like the hardest part is starting. um, so I think that also leads to my other question, where sometimes it seems like it's only like one or two people championing accessibility in their org, and that can feel very, uh, I guess, solitary and lonesome. So where can these champions go for help?
I think like there's always other people that are interested in starting in accessibility. So starting to kind of build an internal squad of people that are cross functionally interested, and then to start finding people even outside of the organization, like having Slack channels and things like that that are dedicated. Maybe not even inside of your organization, but if you feel like you're kind of alone in your organization outside, there's several products. Like I know Zero Height has a Slack. I'm not sure if there's a channel that's dedicated to accessibility, but there's also other accessibility organizations and community groups that are dedicated to accessibility. There's a lot of groups on like LinkedIn and Twitter and other social media, Mastodon, that are really focused on accessibility. So trying to find peers that you can go to when you have questions or need moral support, because sometimes it's a really uphill battle to be fighting for accessibility all the time and feel like you're misunderstood or not supported. That can cause a lot of burnout. So finding people to support you even outside of your organization is a really great thing to do.
Yeah, thanks for
No, I
sharing that,
totally
Jerry.
echo that.
Oh, go
Just
ahead.
in terms of kind of, reaching out and building a community, I always think starting an accessibility guild or a working group is a great thing within an organization. It can just be an informal meetup. It doesn't have to be fancy. I think people are put off with starting these things because they don't have all the answers, but you don't need all the answers. Uh, you just need the willingness to kind of go away and research things and work as a team to kind of solve problems together. um, Everywhere I've worked, I've got together a little group of accessibility champions, and you find there are sort of small pockets of knowledge across, all the different teams. If you go wider than product, there might be people in marketing, there might be people in diversity and inclusion. If you can get all these people together, then all of your specialisms can all come together and help solve the problems. So yeah, getting people together and feeling like you're not on your own. Obviously, if you're not all co-located or in the same time zone, starting a Slack channel or discussion wherever the people hang out can be a good way of all solving problems together.
Yeah, all really great ways. I think there are a lot of resources, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of internet sleuthing or just having conversations with people because, yeah, I've often just started talking about accessibility and I learned that other people have interests too, which I never would have thought of just because we hadn't had that conversation. So I think, just taking that initial step to say hey and nerding out about accessibility. um it's like it's super exciting, at least I think so. Um, but, I think the one thing this kind of leads into accessibility ops. So I think, many of us feel like we're in a race to make something accessible or else. Um, but, when do we cross that finish line and are we done when we get something our products to be accessible? And I wanted to ask this because at Clarity last year, this is where I met Soren, and they spoke about accessibility ops, and that really resonated with me. So, Soren, I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about what accessibility ops is and what accessibility at an org can look like in the long term.
Yeah, so operations at its core is about optimizing and organizing systems, processes, resources that you use to produce your goods or services. So it's really about being efficient and effective in how you produce it, and also giving people kind of a framework to work from. So every time somebody onboards, like if you think of onboarding, that's a kind of operations work. If you think about like when you are creating systems for how people are going to contribute to a design system, that's design operations work. When you think about how do we push code to production, that's development operations work or DevOps. So when you think about accessibility operations, it's really like a little bit more cross-functional, because it's about like how do we measure, how do we standardize, and how do we like start really presenting like this centralized plan for accessibility that thinks about how we approach it and creates a scalable plan that's repeatable no matter who we have in the organization. So like a lot of people get started out and they have someone like Jerry or me, and we come in and we're like, okay, we're going to wear a lot of hats, we're going to do a lot of things, and then if we are not able to work at that company anymore for any reason, like the company doesn't have an accessibility program. So it's like about divorcing it from one person or one role and making it scalable across an organization. It's about spreading out the accessibility across all of those roles and making it a company wide sort of responsibility, just like cybersecurity, just like corporate social responsibility. It's like operationalizing that. Like DE&I is not the responsibility of human resources. It's the responsibility of every department at an organization. And just like that, accessibility has to be too. So it's thinking about like the ways in which we do training, the ways in which we do tools and hire vendors. And it's about like all the little nuances of everything that goes into producing something that's accessible and empowering people to do that.
I really love that because it has accessibility established as more of like infrastructure. So it's not just a quick project to quickly make our buttons accessible and ship it and say we're done, but that it's more of like a thing that lasts a lot longer, and that it is something that everyone can participate. Because I don't know if in your previous experiences, if you feel like accessibility has been like a hot potato and passed from department to department to team because no one's taking ownership. I don't know if you've ever experienced that.
Definitely. And I think sometimes, you have like the accessibility scapegoat in a company, and it's usually not a particular person, but it's a department. So it's like, oh, QA handles that, or design handles that. And then, or development even handles that. So it's usually like there's departments that just kind of feed work in and expect like accessibility magic to come out of one particular department. And it's really about like making sure that people have the resources that they need to, no matter what portion of the journey they're at in their career, or as a corporation, that they have like resources to keep going, both like forward as a company in time, but then like also laterally in their career to become better practitioners as well. Because there's like this level of maturity that needs to happen. And just like we have like design maturity and we have development maturity, you have accessibility maturity too. And so there's like a lot of really complicated models out there. But like I tend to try to like boil it down a little bit so it's a little more easily understandable outside of like product and development, and just kind of think of it as like we have like awareness and like just basic trying, and then you have where you're cranking out accessible stuff and your UI is pretty accessible. Then you have like more of the service design level, and then you have where you have like a accessible culture, and you're thinking about employee experience, and you're thinking about like this operational sort of accessibility. So it's not perfect, and it doesn't address all of the things that you would need to address. And there's models that address that like W3C puts out, that if you're a design operational professional, you can look at those and you can use those to refer to. But if you're trying to say like more evangelize or advocate for uh, accessibility operations, then this more like simple model sort of addresses that and makes it really easy to understand and present if you're presenting to somebody that is, entry level to C-suite. So that really helps people to understand operations as well.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective. I like the idea of like thinking of things as a maturity model because I think a lot of times it's, oh, we don't want to get sued or we are being sued and we need to like make things accessible instantly. And that's that's not an overnight thing, unfortunately. But the maturity level is a really the maturity model that you kind of set forth is a really nice one to think about. Um, so I wanted to shift gears a little bit because I think, when we see the importance of accessibility, we can definitely put a lot of pressure on ourselves not to mess up. So, for example, people are often scared of talking about disabilities or impairments because they might be afraid they're going to say the wrong thing or offend someone. So, how might we help our org navigate this apprehension? And Jerry, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously important we talk about disabilities and impairments in a respectful and inclusive way, that's acceptable to different groups of people. Do some research, ideally with real humans, but if that's not possible, do some desk research. There's lots of excellent charities who publish language guidelines. I think getting together a set of inclusive language guidelines to use in your organization is a nice thing. If you're lucky enough to have, content designers or writing support, lean on them for help. I found in the past a set of inclusive language guidelines helps employees to feel a bit more confident. And as an organization, you're using all of the same language. Actually, it's GDS, Government Digital Service. They've got a great example that you can use as a template for your org, if you want to, have a look at theirs and riff off that. I get a lot of this though, people who are kind of scared or scared to make any efforts in accessibility because they're worried they're going to say something wrong or screw something up. I think we have to be kind to each other. On the flip side, I'd say don't be the inclusivity police, especially, if you're the accessibility lead. You'll sometimes hear things and think, oh, but I think, everyone's learning and we all have to help each other learn along the way. So, yeah, just kind of support each other and learn together, really, and obviously be respectful of people.
Yeah, Soren, I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, so I think it's very situational. The kind of language that people prefer. Like, there's a big movement in Europe, the UK, and the US to move away from like euphemistic language and more towards like either person first or identity first language. So not using things like special needs, which is a euphemism for disability, but use like person with a disability or disabled person, which is person first, and then identity first language. Uh, and then there's a big movement to move away from impairment based language and instead to use things like uh, visual disability rather than visual impairment, especially because you wouldn't usually refer to someone that has a disability like a mobility disability that is in a wheel that uses a wheelchair as someone that has like a walking impairment or something like that. It just doesn't make sense across like most disabilities. So a lot of people are moving away from that. But again, totally geographically and culturally dependent. So I think it's good to know your audience and to think about like just as we localize based on language, it's important that when you're translating things to localize based on what the common language in your area is, and to also when you're talking about individuals, find out what they prefer. Because if you're somebody that's doing content and you're like interviewing someone with a disability, it's important to know like how to spell their name, what pronouns they use, how they want to be referred to, like how they would like their disability to be referred to, how they identify like ethnically as well. Like all those things, if they're important to the story, are important to find out, and they're important for representation sometimes as well. Like how do I refer to you when I post the alternate text for your image? Those things are really important things to kind of find out for context. But again, we don't want to constantly be like nitpicking over things. Like uh, Jerry said, like the inclusivity police. But I think the best thing to do is to just like set a good example. One of the kindest things that people on my team do for me is to advocate for like the correct use of pronouns by saying things like, if somebody misgenders me, to then just use the correct gender, like just emulate the good language. And like things like that are just really kind things that you can do for people on your team. And also just if you are a people manager, to be responsible for the people on your team and to make sure that they have the correct resources, even if it's just within your team, if you can't get them published company wide, to make sure your team has the resources and that you make sure that it's like a safe place for the people on your team to bring their concerns forward, and to also feel like there's not a lot of like derisive language being used in team meetings and things like that. So I think while we don't want to like police people, we also don't want to create an unsafe environment for the people that would be hurt by that language. So it's a fine balance to walk sometimes, but as a people manager, you have to find that balance and to kind of toe that line. And of course, always find out what local laws and like your company policies are on that. But I would say err to the side of advocating for the people on your team in that instance. At least that's what I try to do. Uh, but yeah, I think that emulating the best behavior is the best policy.
Yeah, I think a lot of it boils down to being human and just being respectful to your peers, and, making that safe space. Because I think, like you both mentioned, we all are kind of learning, and language does change and evolve. Um, but one resource I wanted to recommend was a book called Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. Oh, perfect, you have it, yeah. It's a great read,
Such
it's
a great
really.
book. I refer to it all the time.
Yeah, and, like, it really, like, helped me, because I was one of the people that were like, "Oh my gosh, I don't wanna misspeak and say something offensive." So then you just don't say anything at all, which is not helpful. But it really arms you with, like, how to frame things when you word things, and how to recover from making mistakes. And I think everyone realizes that, like, most people don't have a malicious intent to use the wrong terminology, and to give yourself some space and some grace to recover. Like, we're all learning here. And it's a really nice way to. It made me feel okay, right? Like, and made me feel a little bit more confident when talking about different disabilities. And yeah, it's a really great read. I highly recommend it. um, all right, so um, I think, we definitely did focus a lot on products and just, rules and guidelines. But I think another aspect that doesn't get uh, talked about too much is the accessibility for your colleagues. So, um, what can we do to be more inclusive for our teammates? And I guess, Soren, you touched on some of the things that your coworkers do when addressing pronouns, but what other things have you seen be done, or what you have done to be more inclusive for your teammates?
Yeah, so like the first thing I also touched on a little bit in the operations was trainings. Like I don't think I've ever like done onboarding where the trainings have been 100% accessible. There's either been a way where you can't navigate it with a keyboard, or there's not a transcript for a video or subtitles, so or captions. So it's usually a little bit awkward when I like reach out to them and I'm like, hey, just so you know, the vendor turned back a video and it was not captioned, or I just have to reach out and say like it's not accessible, the training. And they're like, oh well, I don't think we have any people with disabilities that need to take this training. And I'm like, well, better to be prepared than not. If you don't think that you do, you might. But I think that that's one way that you can do it, is make sure that things are accessible ahead of time, and also to like even in your hiring process, to make sure that you have accommodations available before you even have somebody ask for them. One of the biggest things I hear from like deaf and hard of hearing folks is that they'll ask for an interpreter during an interview process, and it takes like a month for them to hear back for the next interview date, because it takes so long for them to contract an interpreter and like all of those moving parts. So I think like being prepared for people to ask for those accommodations is really key. So go ahead and have that kind of on deck when you start to open a job rec, and make sure that even the hiring process is accessible.
Yeah, for sure. Jerry, I would love to hear, what are some things that we can do for colleagues based on either some stuff you've done or that you've experienced?
Yeah, I think a lot of focus is on customer, and especially in product, we build to certain specifications and there's a lot of kind of boxes checked. But a lot of these things aren't then carried through to our internal colleagues. Just remembering the basic stuff like internal presentations, things like color contrast or don't use color alone to convey meaning. Remember to use alt text to describe images. Another thing I think people often forget is how important it is to describe images when you're presenting. During a previous contract, I worked with a blind colleague who explained to me that while the actual presentation materials at the company met accessibility requirements, it was the people presenting who didn't. It's really important to explain what's on your slides and not just assume everyone can see the content. Things like that, just kind of day-to-day stuff. As Soren touched on, subtitles, closed captions on videos. I think, if there's a way where people are creating these things internally to kind of switch a lot of the stuff on automatically, people will do it. They're often just not aware of the accessibility features that are baked into stuff. I guess my final thought on stuff around colleagues is internal tooling. It often just totally sucks on the accessibility side, and I think we have to make sure procurement of products from external suppliers, part of that contract is that it meets basic accessibility compliance, because yeah, as you say, you often do like onboarding or something like this, or some like compliance training that's been made by an external company, and there's a lot of accessibility fails in there which people will struggle to get on board with. So yeah, think of your colleagues as well as your customers. Very important.
Yeah, it reminds me of I don't know if Zoom has fixed this, but for a while you can only turn on captions if the admin of the Zoom account had enabled the permission to allow you to turn on captions. And one of my good friends is has hearing loss and it's progressively getting worse. And so like at some point she needed the captions. But then she started a new job and she didn't, she's still getting comfortable with announcing the fact that she has hearing loss. And at a new job, it just felt very awkward. So um she knew she was empowered to do it, but it was hard. So having her have to struggle with that is just it felt really difficult. Um, and I think the other thing is like a lot of people just didn't know that it had to be turned on at the admin level. But they changed that to make it a default, so you don't have to then go seek out turning on captions and um, feeling embarrassed by it. So hopefully they fix that. I don't. That's just a weird wonky UX thing, but stuff like that, I think proactively, if you know about those things, you can do so it's not something that people have to feel uncomfortable with. Because I think for a while she was finding workarounds to get captioning rather than ask somebody. And I think that's the hardship that a lot of us can go through. Um, Especially as someone with ADHD and like a lot of I get very overwhelmed easily. I always thought it was like a me problem and not not the fact that I was just overwhelmed with a lot of content. And so I finally started speaking out about that of like, hey, this is really dense and really hard for me to understand. Can we simplify it? And I think a lot of times people are more than willing to accommodate. They just don't know. And I think over time people start to like recognize how they can help other colleagues. Um, so if anyone has any questions, I know there's a couple questions in the chat. Uh, Feel free to add your question. But I wanted to like ask a question before we jump to the questions about, we touched on this, like, I think, we've spoken a lot about like the human approach to accessibility, where you can have like a presentation that's accessible, but the presenters aren't accessible. So it seems good on paper because we are meeting the WCAG compliance. Um, but I think, that example clearly shows that we're not necessarily making things accessible. So a little bit of a two-part question. Can you tell the audience like how it's possible to make a product unusable when it meets WCAG compliance? And then what can we do to truly make products accessible? Did I ask a very loaded question? Um,
Well, you made me laugh because there's this website that is completely accessible by WCAG standards, but it's very unattractive and it's actually completely unusable. I think Jerry, you're probably familiar because I see you laughing about it. But it's a very funny website. I'm going to find it and drop it in the chat while someone else is talking. But things like that, it's really interesting because like if you make sure that like for example, there's a WCAG guideline that says that every button has to have a unique name, but if the name doesn't make sense, then is it really accessible? If you put alt text on every image, but it's just hot garbage, like, is that really usable? So things like that make me kind of laugh because it's like, well, is that really accessible? Like, it's technically accessible, but does it really consider the experience of someone that's disabled? And I've been doing some legal work recently, in between, layoffs and new job. And I think that there's a real difference between like how people have interpreted the law of like, for instance, in the US, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act and how that applies to the legal burden of companies, and then how it should be to like be truly inclusive. And that's a really fascinating difference to me. It's just really interesting to see how differently that's interpreted, and then how you could be like technically accessible, like, oh, I put alt text on this and it could technically pass the legal burden, but it's not actually inclusively accessible. So there's like a big difference between them.
Yeah, we get a lot of this in design systems. Obviously, having worked on systems for a long time, the sort of idea that all the design system components are accessible, I guess, technically. So it will automatically make an accessible end product. I guess the problem with design system components is they're small chunks that are created independent of the overall semantic structure, and you're relying on consuming teams to put the Lego pieces together the right way. I mean, technically, there's so many things teams can do to accessible component to render it unusable. ARIA is one that always comes to mind. Obviously, ARIA usage has like quadrupled in the last few years. I think since 2019, the WebAIM survey. But implemented incorrectly, ARIA can make the experience a lot worse for people who use assistive technology. um I guess a lot of this does boil down to content, to words. As you were saying, Soren, you can have what was it, a hot mess of garbage, or hot something of, yeah, in your alt text that doesn't make any sense. um Content designers, especially in product teams, focus on the copy we see on the screen, but it's often the words in the code that we don't see that are the most useful to users of assistive tools, things like alt tags, labels, meaningful link names. So, yeah, there's a lot of ways people can potentially take something that is, or sort of like accessible building blocks, and make a totally unusable product. What was the second part of your question, Michelle? How do we make products truly accessible?
yeah.
Oh, goodness. Listen to your users, the real humans. No one outside of product teams cares about technical WCAG compliance. Test with humans. If your company runs, employee resource groups, see if you can leverage them. People are generally happy to pitch in at help. Where I am at the moment at Just Eat, we have a very engaged neurodiversity network and a disability network who are, great for advice. Get close to your customers if you can. Again, another great initiative at Just Eat, they run these customer closeness sessions where, you get assigned a customer and have a one-to-one chat with them for an hour to see how they use our products. So, there's nothing better than that kind of one-to-one human interaction to understand how people use your products. I guess my final thing would be, eating your own dog food. There's a lot of publicity this week for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and it just the horrors of something shared on social media with no alt tags or failing the sort of basics of color contrast. I know people are doing their best, but please eat your own dog food. That's my advice.
Um,
Don't take that literally.
yeah. I think, you mentioned like testing with people, but I guess it can be intimidating because I know people have that interest, but maybe aren't sure where to start because do then you start looking and put a call out to be like, "Hey, I would like to find some blind people to test my product," or I don't know any blind people. Like you'd mentioned the employee resource group, but like how might someone go about and I think personally I would feel nervous if I had people with disabilities and did usability testing because I might not know all the accommodations I need to provide. So I think that can also be very intimidating. So what are some easy ways or approaches teams can take when trying to test for accessibility with real people?
I mean, the first one is employ people that have disabilities so that they can help you design it. I was actually able to work on a great project where we tested a lot of like driverless rideshare uh, features for people with different levels of visual disabilities, from some vision to no vision. And like I was able to like train the whole team that worked with them. And we also worked with Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco and did the testing, based out of their office. So, we worked with people that had some experience. We worked with the Lighthouse for the Blind folks that were used to kind of like interfacing with people that maybe weren't used to working with people that were blind. And then we also did a lot of training, like don't touch people without asking first, and don't assume that people can't get around by themselves just because they have no vision or low vision. And that's like the easiest way. Also, just like starting earlier in the process with co-designing rather than waiting until after you've done everything to test it. I think everybody kind of jumped on Twitter's voice note feature when it came out because there was so much that they could have done there to provide like a transcript or some sort of animation or something, but they just chose to kind of um, to do just like some fun kind of like sound wave animations when that feature was released, and they had to pull it when it was in beta still. And this was years ago, but the whole accessibility community was like, this is not accessible. And if you'd asked anybody, even people that were not deaf or hard of hearing, they would have told you that this is not accessible. And I think just sometimes just starting a little bit earlier in the process and saying like, how could we design this to be accessible out of the gate, making it part of the definition of done, part of the requirements of the feature, is a great way to just to get started with making things accessible and making sure that what you're building really does serve people with disabilities. um, yeah, I think that's the biggest part of it. And then working with people that have disabilities, you don't always have to ask if they have a disability. You can ask if they use assistive tech, because that's a really great indicator. Like if you put a call out and say, I'm looking for people that use both voiceover and magnification, you'll probably get people that have low vision. If you're looking for people that use like voiceover and JAWS, you'll get people that are like have very little vision or are blind. So it's a way to kind of get around asking people personal information and really asking them more about the technology that they use. And that's a lot more impersonal. It's more like, hey, do you use iPhone or Android? Like, do you use JAWS? Which is similar to voiceover in that it's a screen reader. So things like that will get you a good mix of people that have different kinds of disabilities, and maybe don't even consider themselves to have a disability, but it'll give you a wide range of experiences and a wide range of different accessibility needs.
That's really great. I love the idea of hiring people with disabilities and co-designing and or starting early, being more proactive. Like accessibility shouldn't be a reactive thing. I think, it has become a reactive thing. But I think, teams are slowly shifting from that. I wanted to while we have some time ask questions from the audience. So, um Tara asked, do you have any suggestions on how to get buy-in from your stakeholders when they feel that accessibility is going to slow down project process?
Joe, do you
That's
want
a
to take a
tough
whack
one.
at it?
So how to get buy-in from your stakeholders when accessibility is going to slow down project process. It might slow it down at that time, but it's going to slow you down a lot longer further down the pipe if you don't mitigate the accessibility issues to start with. I think that's the difficult thing. Something like 60% of accessibility issues start in design. If you can train your designers and get some good process in place with design, there'll be a lot less problems going into engineering. If you have, solid pipeline testing and accessibility checks along the way there, if it all comes to the end and you're about to ship something and it gets tested and it fails accessibility, and you are legally required to make a product accessible, then that's going to take a lot longer than doing the accessibility up front. Now, I appreciate that's a lot easier said than done, having worked in product teams who have to ship things under a deadline.
Yeah, for sure. I think at some point, you just have to go like I'm tired of asking for permission, right? I'll just go and do it. Because like, fuck it. It's what's important to you, and to people. And they can just deal. The
I think
stakeholders.
it. I think another thing is
I want you
that
on my team.
I think another thing that a lot of people have that objection at the beginning, and I would say that yes, anything that you start at first is going to take a little bit more time. Like when you start agile, like switching from waterfall to agile, it takes teams a little bit more time to complete work because they're getting used to a new system and a new way of doing things, and there's trainings, and you got to make sure to like start doing business as usual. And so there's like a little bit of a false start sometimes on things. And yeah, it takes more time, but it's an investment. And people see that as an investment because it operationalizes things and gets people on the same schedules and all of that. So, yes, initially, accessibility for the first couple of years is a little bit of a learning curve, especially as it's not something that is as well trained in a lot of education programs. I would say any kind of education program, boot camps, software engineering programs, developer programs, universities, all of those places, like none of them really teach accessibility. I've seen maybe a couple places have an accessibility class as part of a design program, but most places they don't teach accessibility. So it's something that you're learning on the job. And a lot of places are just now kind of getting around to including learning on the job. So yeah, you're playing catch up, and that's kind of sucks sometimes to have to do that. But once you invest in it, it pays off because you're not having to kind of like come around and do work twice. And a lot of times when you're having to go back and redo stuff, things change. So by the time you've gotten through it the first time and you go, oh, we have accessibility problems that we've detected in QA, we got to send this back through the pipeline and now it's got to be redeveloped. Uh, by that time there's compatibility issues, and the design system has changed and you've got to update the design system components that are within it, and then the code has to be updated again, then you have to redeploy. So it does end up wasting time, even more than that, just like 60% of like issues that you find in design. So I think investing in accessibility pays off more than we can really measure, not just from that end of just an efficiency standpoint, but you have like innovation standpoint, and then just like winning and retaining people, because while we toss around that like 20% of people have disabilities overall, estimated 34% of people in the US scored on the disablement index in the census in 2021. So that means 34% of working age adults, that's like 18 to 54, scored on the disablement index, which means they have some sort of disability and they have expendable income. So I think that's a really important number to consider because we're kind of like filtering out some outliers in, the age categories that would maybe throw some of those numbers off. But that's a big amount of people that are looking to spend money that have some sort of access needs. And we have to consider those people when we're thinking about, trying to win some of those market shares. So even from that standpoint, we need to talk to stakeholders about, if we think it's going to slow it down, then we're leaving out 34% of that market.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think we are recording this webinar, so you can always play back that snippet that Soren just said. Don't play the snippet that I said. Soren's answer was much better. So I think that's the thing is use that as some fuel for some of the initiatives to get buy-in, because it's not necessarily coming from you, it's coming from an expert. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let's see, we have maybe time for one or two more questions. So Deborah asks, do you have any recommendations on which set of standards are best as a starting point, especially for a global company? And then she was also wondering if you had any examples of places that do accessibility and everything mentioned here as well. And maybe there's not one unicorn organization, maybe there is, but if you have a couple recommendations when it comes to working internally as well as external products and documentation, would love to hear your thoughts. Jerry, would you like to start?
As the standards nerd, I guess WCAG for me, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is always going to be my go-to. If you're operating in Europe, there's the EN 301549. They've made that particularly accessible name-wise, the harmonized ICT standard. That one is cited in lots of the laws, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on the European Accessibility Act, and a lot of the regional or national laws within Europe are using that as the standard. In terms of companies or organizations who do accessibility particularly well, for me, it's always the Government Digital Service here in the UK. They've got a fantastic design system. It's really well documented. Their GitHub issues are just a goldmine of research and people chatting about different patterns. So they're always my go-to for accessibility.
And Soren, what about you?
So yeah, I think a lot of the standards that I've seen, I just finished editing a book that references like EU standards and UK standards and US standards, and I'm pretty sure almost all of them at least refer to WCAG, WCAG standards. So I would say that's a pretty safe bet to refer to. And if you're dealing with like mobile, it's a little bit less clear because most of the standards apply to websites, but a lot of a lot of mobile applications are going to have like a lot of the same standards, I would assume. Material design sometimes addresses some of them, but I wouldn't say all of them. So I think that's where internal documentation can be really helpful because you can kind of go through and evaluate if material design has any gaps that your application maybe needs filled, and that you can kind of on a case by case look up best practices and see if there's anyone doing similar things that you think would be really great things to reference. And Michelle, I really love that it depends that's in your background, because I think it also really does depend on what your company does, because it's really helpful to sometimes see those standards in practice. And when I started my last long-term job, it was e-commerce. And so I was for the first time like, oh, I haven't really done a lot of accessibility for e-commerce, like strike-through pricing. How do I make that accessible? It's not something I know off the top of my head. I'm sure I could figure it out, but I'm sure there are other people that have thought about this. So I started looking for teams that were publishing things that they were doing. And like the Shopify team has a blog where they talk about accessibility issues that they're facing or have solved. And they talk about like their reasoning and the standards they referenced. And so things like that can be really, really helpful. And I work as a maintainer for the A11Y project, which is an open source project on the web. It's one of the longest running different sourced resources online, and it's a really helpful place to find some of those bits and pieces from across the web. But I would say find teams that are doing similar things. Like if you're in e-commerce, there's Shopify, there's, like lots of other teams that are doing that e-commerce kind of stuff. But like find teams that are doing things that are similar, that are publishing, and or connect with people on LinkedIn and start working groups and share like common struggles and things that you're doing. Go to meetups. Like there's one in New York called A11Y NYC, and people will share case studies at those a lot of times. And I think that's a really great way to kind of like learn outside of those guidelines as well, or to really understand how the guidelines are applied, because the guidelines are great. But if we don't really know how they can be applied, then I don't think that they're super useful.
For sure. And those guidelines are kind of litigious looking and daunting. But I think they are definitely making it easier. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So we're going to have to run. But I feel like Jerry, Soren, and I could keep talking forever about accessibility. But thank you so much for joining, everyone. We will put all the resources mentioned in the show notes of this page, as well as put a recording up, and we'll send out an email when that's all ready. But I hope you all enjoy Global Accessibility Awareness Day tomorrow. There's tons of events going on, and hopefully you can tune in or see some of them in person. But thank you again so much, Soren and Jerry. It was great speaking with you all and nerding out about accessibility.